All right. Well, I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us here in person tonight. It's nice to see everyone actually in person putting sort of names and faces to people. It's also great to hear the different conversations going on in the room. And one of the true upsides of being in person is getting the chance to get to know people a little bit on the side. So really appreciate everyone joining us on a beautiful summer evening. So I want to get started right away so that we make the best use of our time. And I know we all have our name tags on here, so I don't think we need to redo introductions. But if someone has, wants to do that, we're happy to. A couple of quick things before I turn it over to Steve is hopefully most of you know, but the restrooms are out the hall on your way back towards the front door on your right-hand side. Please feel free to jump up at any point in time. There are snacks over on the side. So this is designed to be informal. So please get up and move around if you need to. Just know that if you're going to speak, you need to press the button on the microphones that are near you. So you might have to share. And when it's green, like mine is, that means you're being picked up. When it's red, that means that it is off. So just when you go to say something, we might have to prompt you, but just remember you have to turn that on. So with that, I think that's all the logistics necessary. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve, who has graciously joined us in person and is going to walk us through tonight's workshop.
Thanks, Scott. Hi, everybody. Hey, Julie and Sam, in case you guys want to know where your restroom and facilities are, well, hopefully you do. You know that anyways. So anyways, it's good to see you guys. Thank you for being with us here. And I'm joined by Sam Lieberman. This is a little bit of a swap-orama tonight. Sam was going to be here, but well, something came up with him and his family, and I'll let him choose if he wants to indicate, but he unfortunately could not make it out here tonight, and so I came up here. I was originally not expected to be here tonight, and I want you to all to understand why, and I ask for some of your grace and mercy tonight. I had cochlear implant done on 7/11 day, July 11. And so my right ear is absolutely deader than a doorknob, let me tell you. But I do have a semi-good ear on the left-hand side. So I just ask for some of your grace tonight that if I need to ask you to just repeat it again. I'm really good at reading lips, so that's for sure. So, and I get activated tomorrow morning as long as my flight leaves on time tonight at 11 o'clock. So we'll see how that goes. Anyways, it's good to see you all here. It's good to participate with you in person. And Julie, we miss you. And hope that you will have an opportunity to see you on August 10th. And of course, Sam, we miss you as well being here. So we thought that to get started tonight, our focus primarily tonight is to be able to gain your feedback, any questions or thoughts that you had in terms of the report that we had prepared as part of this, and we'll kind of unpack that as we go through tonight. Tonight is an opportunity for us to just be able to understand, I guess, the issue that is before this team, and opportunities to address those issues with respect to the various budget strategies that we identified. So we're going to be able to unpack, I think, some of the things that were in that report. I'm hopeful that I'm not going to call out anybody, but I'm just hopeful that you all have had an opportunity to review it, read it, thoughtfully review it. We look forward to just any questions that you have or any additional thoughts that you have on some of the strategies that were identified, but also what was not there that you were expecting perhaps to see that would be important for this team to be able to consider as you help provide your input to the city manager in terms of a path forward. And so that's kind of what we're going to be doing tonight. And Sam, I don't know, is there any words of wisdom that you'd like to share before we jump into the slide deck that you're going to start sharing in a second here?
No words of wisdom, just that I have 2 young children. We are all sharing a bug that I was not going to bring to you all, which is what has kept me home tonight, unfortunately. But I'm looking forward to the discussion today, and I'll let you get to it.
You have a very sharing family, Sam. So, anyways, we prepared a slide deck that is only meant to just kind of be a visual for us to just be able to talk through. But really, the essence of tonight is based on the information that was provided to you in advance. And I know that there have been some emails that Micah sent out even as late as about an hour plus ago or so, perhaps, of some input that that some of you provided, as well as perhaps some people from the community that had done that. So before we jump in, just as a check-in, if you will, for tonight, does anybody have anything that they wanted to share as we start tonight before we get into the meat of the stuff? So, no? Okay. Have you met some new friends tonight that you didn't otherwise know? Or do you guys pretty much know each other? New friends. There we go. Good. Good. Well, great. All right. Well, so let's just kind of look at and triangulating where it is that we are in this process. And so we've done the first two meetings, and I believe at the last meeting that Sam, and in fact I watched it, Sam was able to share with you some of the really the information from the forecast, and we're just going to recap that a little bit here in a moment. But tonight it's about just reviewing those budget strategies. We'll discuss those and get ourselves aligned so that on August 10th, you'll be tasked with providing your input, and maybe even before that, and we'll talk about that as we get to the end. But also, ultimately trying to formulate your consensus or recommendations to the city manager on how to address the city's projected fiscal gap for the future. And that will be what we do on August 10th. And if necessary, the meeting after that is August 24th. It's a little covered by one of the Zoom windows, but we've asked you all to hold the 24th as well in case you need further conversation to be able to finalize your recommendations, if you will, to Scott. So any questions about what we're going to be doing tonight? Ready? All right. Well, I think there's a good place to start, and we're not going to do an exhaustive read of the memo because or the report, you've already seen it. But I do want us to reflect back on what Sam had shared with you at the last meeting, which was the updated financial forecast based on the most recent amended biennial budget for 23 and for 24. And as I heard from watching the meeting, I think you all at least saw what the issue was. The forecast shows that there is this imbalance between revenues and expenditures in future years, a lot of which is just really summarized by the fact that your largest revenue source, property tax, is only allowed to really grow at that 1% level, but the cost of providing services is typically grown at a rate that's a little bit faster than that. And that led to a gap that if it was based on the assumptions that were built in there, which Sam went through with all of you last time, that indicated that if it was not repaired, it would basically lead to the city, using potentially all of its reserves that it has built up over the years by 29, if you will, and falling below the city's current minimum reserve threshold in that year of 10% of annual operating revenues. But what we're recommending is that in both cases, you're really looking at it from the expenditure side. And we've painted the graph to show you the difference between 10% versus 25% of operating expenditures, because when you're setting reserves, you really want to focus on how much will you be able to continue to provide services if there was a significant depletion in revenue sources, because that's really what you're trying to manage when you're doing this forecasting. But I think it's really important to also indicate here that the graphs that were presented to you last time, and I think that Sam mentioned this, but I just want to underscore that, is that this does not assume that there is any additional expenditures related to any of the underfunded or unfunded capital improvement needs that you have. We know that you have a transportation master plan, you have a parks master plan, you have all, facilities master plan that's going to need to be done. Any of those types of projects that are on that list that are currently not already funded by existing dedicated revenue sources, like, for example, REIT or gas tax revenues, et cetera, are not assumed to be coming out of the general fund. And so those are not a part of this, nor is it part of it that the general fund would participate in any debt service that might be required if you decided to advance fund some of those types of things. And so anyway, so that's what the forecast showed. And I think that it's a really important point for us and where we are to just ensure, do we all share this common understanding of this gap? I mean, do you understand it? Do you recognize it? And do you recognize the fact that this is something that needs to be addressed? And, because at the last meeting, it seemed like you all took it in. I didn't hear any significant discussion about assumptions or other things upon which the forecast is based. But I just wanted to take a pause for a moment, because if we're not all understanding that there's a gap, then we need to step back and say, okay, what is it that we're really trying to solve here? So I just want to kind of open that up to any questions, thoughts that you have about the gap. So Don first, then Debbie, and I want to make sure I'm able to somehow see Julie as if she has her hand raised or whatever. So Mike, you watch that. So Don, go ahead.
I looked at when you presented the modeling to the council, and you started in, I think, like 2017 or something like that. And I was wondering why we didn't go back to the beginning of the city, because for the first 19 or 20 years, we didn't have a negative general fund. And how did we get to this point? What made it fall off the cliff? I don't really understand that. And so I can see the numbers you're showing us and the budget. Yeah, it looks bad, but how did we get there? And so I asked for some more information on well, key issues like legal costs, for example. I know they went up. I'm probably guilty of some of that. But I'd like to better understand what numbers created this.
Please again, Don, what numbers, what?
What numbers created this cliff that we're falling off of?
Yeah. So as we shared with the council back in 21, it was 2021 when we did the first forecast, that the city has had a history of being able to have general fund reserves, being able to be maintained or even increased over the years. A lot of it was due to, in some cases, expenditure savings or, budgeting for a certain amount of expenditures, but those were not expended, which we have incorporated now in this forecast on an ongoing basis, as well as revenues were being conservatively projected. Projecting revenues sometimes is like an act of crystal ball gazing, and just trying to predict and understand where things are. And we have seen that in the last couple of years, those numbers have gotten a little bit, closer together, but there's still, some surprises. And we also have this crazy pandemic during this time that was difficult to also predict revenues from. But as we looked at, so over time, the city has been able to maintain reserves above its minimum threshold in a lot of cases because of either development that had been going on in the past that provide some of that one-time revenues, and in some cases, some additional windfalls of revenues that had come in, which the city then used to fund some capital projects. As well as on the expenditure side, is that the city had had created a budget that had some additional appropriations in it than perhaps maybe what was necessary. I know that there have been some growth in terms of the services that have been requested and required to serve the community, which is why the expenditure line has trended up a little bit over the last few years. But as we look forward, as we look at based on the 23 and 24 operating budgets, as well as then the projected revenues, and if we take that as our baseline, and then we look and see what does the forecast hold, even using historical references in terms of sales tax growth, in terms of development growth, now that we know that development activity is starting again in earnest. And as we also look then at the expenditure side, there is this imbalance. There is this imbalance that exists between the growth of revenues in the future and the cost of providing services that you're currently providing today. And so that is what we have been basing our analysis on for the future. And so the past has been great in terms of being able to build those reserves up to a certain level. But there has also been a desire to expand services, and that variance between your revenues growth pattern and your expenditures are just not planned to keep pace in the future. So I don't know if that I don't know if that was helpful.
Well, it was helpful. You did mention the fact that development dropped off in recent years, and we're getting a lot of impact fees and sales tax on construction, which went away. And my concern is, did the community development staff get decreased? Because in the past, the fees that were coming in were paying for the staff more or less. So if there's a service there that's out of balance, we should be looking at the service delivery methods also.
Yeah, and I think that there's a couple things I wanted to mention. I don't know if Scott, if you wanted to reflect on any of that, but one of the I remember this back in like the late 1990s and early 2000s, as I was meeting with the finance director of Redmond, and the significant growth that Microsoft was going through, which you all have lived through. Some of you may have even worked for them in the past. That significant growth that was going on, Redmond got themselves into a bad situation where they were making assumptions in their forecast that growth was going to continue. And as I think was mentioned at the last meeting, the sales tax revenues that you enjoy here in Sammamish comes from the traditional retail sales, but it also comes from that construction tax, the construction portion, if you will, of use tax, if you will. And Redmond found themselves in a real problem when the bomb hit, the dot-com bust hit. Microsoft stopped its rampant development, and all of a sudden those new revenue sources for them were drying up. And we have seen that with some other cities here in not only King County, but also throughout the state of Washington, because it's great when you're getting that. But then the question becomes, if there's significant construction and then all of a sudden it stops or slows down, what happens to the future, right? So the forecast that has now been built that's based on 23 and 24 projected revenues are assuming that in some regards that construction is starting again, but it's also being realistically conservative in terms of what continued growth do we expect? And I know that another part of that, and maybe we'll talk about that as we go through the budget strategies, when we talk about economic development opportunities and some of the sites that are currently being looked at here in town to be able to be developed. Question becomes, how much can we realistically expect that some of those developments will come to fruition? And if they do, which is great, what is the true potential revenue generation that they have? And I want to talk about that as we kind of go through that. And maybe I spoke too much. And Dan, I don't know if I addressed your point on that, and if Scott had anything else to add. Right. Debbie, you.
Yeah, thank you. I had two thoughts. I mean, one is it really doesn't matter what the history is, because In fact, the future is 1% growth in revenue and a 5% growth in cost in general, just looking at the assumptions. And so we're going to have a deficit if we have to live within that going forward, with property taxes the primary source and labor agreements and all the rest of it. You're not going to be able to hold that to 1% growth. That's just not going to happen. So I think in the future, it's pretty clear that we are fighting a deficit, and I think a lot of companies are, frankly. But I have two thoughts about it. One is I think it's worthy of a little bit more discussion about the ideal reserve goal, because I know you mentioned, or Steve did, Sam did,
Yeah.
that there was discussion about that. And, I totally agree that making a reserve as a percent of revenue is a bad idea. That's kind of not relevant. You want your reserve to be money that's available to cover costs. If some catastrophe happens, you can pay your bills for 3 months, for example, which is your 25%, right? But I'm just curious about people's thoughts. And my understanding is that our adjacent cities don't carry that level of reserve. So I'm just kind of curious if you have that information for our comparable cities, and then why 25 versus 10, say, or something less.
Yeah. Let me unpack a little bit of that concept if I can. So firstly is that the best practice throughout the United States for minimum reserve targets for a municipality's general fund, which we talked about over the last couple of meetings, what the general fund is and what the, really the focus of our discussions here is a best practice that's been identified by a bunch of finance people that have gotten together, finance wonks, as I like to call us from the Government Finance Officers Association, that have identified that throughout the United States, based on the revenue sources that are typical, is that it's a prudent yet responsible reserve threshold to have 2 months of annual operating expenditures, which rounded is about 17%. Okay. But your results may vary based on the mix of revenues that you have and what their sources are. And also what your history has been in terms of and also your risk threshold as a community, ultimately manifested through your elected officials, the city council, in terms of what is the right amount of reserves to have there. So the 2 months is the typical standard, but cities will look at it differently. Some cities that are 90+% know what their revenues are going to be. Let's say it's like a known property tax amount, and short of the likelihood of a huge flood or some other major catastrophe throughout the community that could devastate that. Unfortunately, like my family experienced in Paradise, California, when they were part of that whole big fire that happened a couple of years ago, is that you might, if you have a predictable revenue source, you might be able to say, well, I think we can get away with something a little bit less, maybe like that 10% level. But in other cases, if you have some revenue sources that have some economic volatility in them, like sales tax, hotel tax in some states, in some areas that rely on that, other, a tourism area, if you will, they have a much more, volatile threshold, and they may want to have 3 or 4 months of annual operating expenditures because the dip could be so significant. The other part of this it gets is as it relates to cash flow. What is the right, when is the cash coming in, and how do you make sure that you have the right cash flow that you need in a certain fund to address that? So all of that said, the 2 months tends to be the standard. And then it varies from there based on each agency's perspectives. The lower your reserve threshold, the riskier it becomes, and the more quick you're going to have to be able to turn off that expenditure spigot, reduce services to be able to, keep yourself above the runway, as I like to say. But having a lower reserve threshold gives you an opportunity to maintain services more often, and to live more based on, well, let's hope and keep a really close focus on that. We think that a 25% threshold here in Sammamish would be prudent, given the mix of sales tax revenues that you have, the development revenues that are part of the general fund, which you've been reliant on in past, and and we see how the future holds. We think that 25% level makes sense, and that's why we painted this graph and the scenarios that were included in the report that was sent to you, with those two levels, so that you can see and understand and then perhaps manage your reserves to maintain those certain amount. So I know it kind of went on a little bit, but we think that 25% makes a lot of sense here based on the mix of revenues that you have. I would really hope that the city would consider at least the minimum reserve that's stipulated by the GFOA of the 2 months, and to get that up to at least 17%. But whether it's 17% or 25%, I mean, the way that this graph paints it, something's going to have to be done, right? The question becomes how quickly and how willing are you to wait for those potential reserves to hit that point until you act. And so we also have pushed the concept in this discussion here when it comes to reserves and managing the reserve levels, is to also think about in terms of the introduction of these strategies, so that they have time to be able to have the impact that's necessary to keep you well above the runway. So Debbie, that was a long response, I know, but did that answer your question?
It does. I'm kind of curious how other members of the committee feel about that. That's, I know there's debate about it in the community, so I was just curious if anybody's kind of on board with that being one of the assumptions, because it would change. I mean, it still eventually catches up with us, but I don't know how many more years we get out of it if we reduce the reserve expectation. I'm not suggesting we should. I just, in business, 3 months of expenses is a very small reserve. So I mean,
that's basically 1 month, just over 1 month, right? So yeah. Are there any other thoughts or feedback or?
I'm really supportive of the 25% reserve.
Go ahead, Owen.
I have a point of clarification on the tax levy. So when you say that we can only grow by 1% per year, does that mean that right now we're levying $100 and next year we can only levy $101? Is that how that works?
That is 100% correct,
So
or 1% correct. Yes.
well, that's the problem right there.
Isn't it crazy? Yeah.
I just wanted to know. Just want to make sure I'm understanding the
It's fairly
point.
simple.
It's a terrible assumption, but
Yeah.
you're dealing with this issue and this issue.
Yeah. And the nuance behind it, not to go down a rabbit hole here, but it's exactly what you said, Owen. It's not your $100. It's the city's $100. It can only be increased to $101. And then that gets reallocated to everybody based on your pro rata assessed valuation that you have. So in some cases, how that gets divvied up is based on the county tax assessor's office.
Let me think out loud here
Yeah.
in terms of everyone's tax bills. If you can only increase the total amount by 1%, and everyone's assessed values of the homes are going up much faster, then wouldn't everyone's real estate tax bill go down a lot?
If there's no additional development and you all have the same homes, and even if you went up, the rate goes down. The rate per $1,000 would go down. But if everybody's assessed valuation creeped up at the same amount and you increased the total levy by 1%, everybody would basically pay 1% additional. It's just the rate upon which you're assessed goes down because the
Property values are going up-
denominator changes.
Go up 10, 15% per year. Some
Yeah.
places, right?
Scott, did you want
So
your?
someone
Well-
enjoying the new rate, right?
Well, so
That's why I don't hear about it. I don't see news about it. Everyone's saying, hey, I've got lower tax rate or lower assessed. tax rate.
so the unique challenge as well is that we're just discussing the city portion of your overall tax bill. It doesn't include all the other taxing agencies that make up your total tax.
Right, but this is
So-
the bulk of it.
Well, no, it's not. It's actually
Tiny
quite,
part.
it's not anywhere near the bulk of it. The city portion is actually, I think it's in total, Aaron, give me a little prompt here. I think it's, I think it's 20% or even less. 14%
Oh, okay.
of your total tax bill is the city's portion.
Mhm.
And then you have the state, you have King County, you have your schools, you have special purpose districts, all those equal up to the total pie.
Mhm.
So we are just talking about the 14% portion of your overall tax bill.
I guess all the other line items are going up.
Correct.
That's the deal. So it gets. it's
John,
smoothed
go ahead.
out
Oh,
there.
sorry.
Uh,
I think like the county can raise, so they can get a 1% raise and the state can get a 1% raise. City can get a 1% raise. I don't know about the school district levy, that may be going up more because there's voter approved. Because I know your tax bill goes up quite a bit. Now maybe your city portion may go up or down a little bit. And that I think in 2001, there was initiative 747, and I kind of had to go back and check that again. But before that, the 90s real estate values were going up, a lot, 5 or 7% a year. And and the taxes really did go up around, in Washington. And so there was an initiative in, I think, 2001 that got passed, by all the voters in the state that set that 1% limit, because before that it was taxes were going up 5 or 7%. And so they kind of limited that.
On a different topic, just to get some. On a different topic about the kind of past learnings. I guess some of the members here have been involved with the council or some Amish for many, many years. And just to follow up on Don's kind of question about what do we do in the past that got us to a good place? Are there any learnings there that we can apply today to manage our future? If we've been managing well, let's say 10 years ago during that time, and we built up this reserve, well, what do we do there that we can employ now as a start, right? We did well then. Let's do some of those things. And then once we exhaust those issues, then we can go down this other list here of options.
Yeah.
So I would just love to know what we did back then that got us to the right place.
Yeah, I think that partly it's, what are the opportunities to expand the pie? That doesn't necessarily mean new taxes. That just means what are ways that you can expand the pie? Because remember, you've had you had a good track record of some development that was going on after you incorporated, way back when, right? So there's that, as well as the fact that the per capita expenditures that you spent back, then have grown, right? And so the question becomes, what is it goes back to, I think, one of the things that we had in the slide of what is the proper price of government that the residents of Sammamish are willing to pay for government services, and what are the types of services that you are expecting? And I know that there has been a desire to provide a higher level of service and more services perhaps over the last few years. Partly it's a result of population growth, but also it's part of just the nature of wanting to have great services. And so the question becomes, to what extent is that sustainable? Because when you look at it on a per capita basis, you were spending less than you are today. Part of that is the growth of the cost. Don, you mentioned in your email about inflation and that it's been somewhat favorable in the last few years or whatnot. But it ultimately comes back to, Owen, is that what is the right services? What are the services that the city wants to provide to the community? How much does it cost to provide that? And because I think that your level of service, from what I've heard and seen, have increased over the last few years. So
I think those slides that show what we spend per capita versus what other cities, I was thinking when I looked at, oh, Mercer Island's going to spend far more money per capita than we do, and they spend less. I think that's one of the cities I thought was comparable. I was really struck by that, because I think we have a nice life here, a very nice life. We have music in the parks. I misspeak for parks because I'm a parks person, right? We have music in the parks. We have amenable staff. We do good planning. So we have a very high level of service for what looks like, compared to everybody else, very cheap. I was struck by that.
yeah, and those are on pages 7 and 10 that you're referring to, Nancy, which is that per capita revenues versus expenses, and you saw that it was like Sammamish's is $881 general fund revenue per capita, whereas the average for all the other peer agencies is 1,700. It's almost double. Same thing on the expenditure side. You're spending about 975 per capita, whereas the average is 1,600. But we also have to look at some of these other agencies and what are they doing that is instructive there. I mean, Bellevue, I'm just amazed with seems like it's a retail mecca for some time, in some regards. They have a lot of retail. They have a lot of sales tax that they're generating there, because they've made choices in terms of development. Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I'm with the group here to help me understand making decisions better. It would be helpful to get some feedback there, some specifics, because I know we say services went up, and that doesn't help me a lot. I don't know what that means. That mean we doubled the police? We have twice as many fire departments? I don't know. I don't know what that really means. So some specifics would be great. And I also wondering, well, if because I've been here since '95, and I thought, it's going pretty good. And then I don't know was there some giant expenditure that tipped the whole thing over? Or was it just, death of 1,000 paper cuts over time? And even though we're growing, just because if I do my budget, right, and the population grows, well, so does the revenue. So I'm not sure why population growth is the enemy. It is merely, it doesn't
mean for population growth to be reflected.
well, one of our slides did say, the problem was that, the taxes didn't keep up with our growth. It's like, what? You grow and you get more taxes. So that makes sense to me. But reversing a bit, I would like to know what was it? What did we do to get in a good spot? What happened to us that caused us to be in this situation? Because I think we'll do this now. I would hate for in 5 years from now, another task force gets together and says, hey, we got to try this again, because I think we're doing this for some permanence, I'm guessing, right? We're trying to solve this permanently. And then what other communities do, I guess there's some, benchmarking with that. But on the other side, budgets are not that useful because people can spend a lot of money, right? Look at the federal government. I would, you can spend yourself to death, which is what some people do. It's more like, what are we spending it on, and what decisions can we make going forward? I don't know if we do have, I don't know, Scott, if you have some specifics or who has a history on what, again, was it just 1,000 paper cuts? Or was there some turning point for us?
So I haven't been here that long, but I can give you the my version of what I think it is. And I won't deep dive into this because we will rabbit hole, but some broad pieces. One is we annexed Klahani. We basically swallowed a small city and brought on Klahani's about 20,000 residents. When you annex a area that size, that comes with service delivery impacts that you have to try to account for, because now we're responsible for all the service delivery there. So it's well, but what you have to remember is that the revenue, it doesn't keep up with the service demands. And this is part of going all the way back to what Richard said. Initiative 747 happened all the way back in 2001. It was invalidated and the legislature implemented it. Since that time, we've been under the 1% cap. And what happens over time is expenses or inflation across the board has been going up over that time. Now you might have these revenue bumps where you get what I would call big construction or one-time jumps, right? So you get those in and you're like, great, we brought in more than we budgeted for. Awesome. We put that in fund balance. That's amazing. We sit on that. And then you can do things like pay for capital as you go if you're able to get those. But what Steve is talking about is the ongoing things that you can count on over time. So if you forecast out over time, you have to be able to make reasonable assumptions that you're going to count on those revenue sources. Those one-time jumps, they're just that. They're one-time dollars. Big sales tax spikes from big construction, that's a one-time that you shouldn't be budgeting for moving forward because it's not a sustainable revenue source. So over time, and then things like council a few years ago decided that the service level they were getting from King County for the signals was not what they wanted it to be. So they brought that service in-house. And that comes with all the traffic signals. So all that was brought in-house. So with that comes, well, you have to have the staff to be able to do that work. And then you own all the equipment, you own all the maintenance, you own all the upkeep. So as we were doing that, expenses were going up with that before you're contracting out, but you want a higher level of service. So by definition, a higher level of service means it costs more. Well, it's just what we were no longer paying King County. Right. So we have been, in the other pieces, we've been a very traditionally contract heavy city. We've contracted out for almost everything. A lot of times what it boils down to is if you want a more consistent level of service and a better level of service, you bring it in-house because then you can control what happens when. So those are all points on the graph, if you will. And then over the last few years, overall costs have just been skyrocketing. Now, this problem was identified, Aaron, help me out, it was like 2 or 3 bienniums ago that we started looking out saying, we're going to reach a point where, and when you have these windfalls where you get more than you bring in, you're like, great, you kick the can down the road. You keep pushing the out year, but we're at a point now, I don't think we can push the out years anymore, which is why I'm so appreciative of all of you to sit down and go through this with us, because we have to have a plan so that we don't keep getting to that point on the graph. We might decide, for instance, to spend down the reserves to just the reserve level, because sitting on, what do you sit on extra reserves for aside from your rainy day fund? So, but in order to get there, we have to be able to keep up our revenues with our expenses over time. And so,
And I guess one other clarification, sorry about that, is that when you talk about, and Steve, I think you said this, the capital expenditures. Did you say that, we're working with the general fund, but none of what we're doing here, we're just going to keep capital as is, whatever was approved is approved, but we're not also trying to fill a gap of adding money into the general fund to fund the capital?
The based on the assumptions, right?
Yeah.
The forecast shows that even without funding those unfunded, underfunded needs, that there is a problem that's got to be addressed. Now, some of the scenarios that we're about to go into once we start getting into those is that you will see that the way they've been developed is that they try to keep you off the runway and keep your elevation up high, right? But it allows some growth opportunity, and there ends up being some additional capacity, fiscal capacity, to be able to address some of those needs. And one of the scenarios, I think, actually provides about over $10 million of additional funding capacity. It's not 400 million, it's not 100 million, but at least it's something to be able to generate some capacity. And I think that to the extent that this team wants to at least provide some recommendations that could provide additional fiscal capacity for the city to be able to address those needs, that's kind of your choice in terms of how you want to formulate that. But I think that that's something that just at a baseline level, we've got to make sure that the operations are taken care of, right? So, yeah. I don't want to lose sight of Debbie's question about the reserve threshold and, what are we really trying to focus on? And I wanted to hear from other folks in terms of that from a fiscal planning perspective. Where are you with respect to this 10% versus 25% issue? Any further insights or input that you want to provide to that? John, go ahead.
Well, I think the most important thing is we don't kick the can down the road again. As a very, very general rule, cities can't live on property tax alone. Sammamish is lucky in the sense that we have such high valuations, and that eases that. Mercer Island, same. Point cities also. But somehow you need that stable triad of revenue. That's often utility tax, maybe a B&O, your sales tax. We're lacking those second, third legs of the stool to hold us up. And then talk about kicking the stool out from under us, the 1%, that really, really hurts us going forward. So not kick the can down the road. Where we land on the reserve level, higher is probably better than lower, but let's see what the appetite is for changes.
You think it's better to have a lower minimum reserve threshold?
No, higher.
Oh, got it. Okay, all right.
But
Thank you.
also balanced out with what's the appetite for changes in service levels and or additional revenues. Oh,
Larry looks like he's about to grab the mic. Go ahead, Larry.
Partnership up here with John. I wrote some of these notes a little earlier, and one was about the contract city. That was the early history of Sammamish. I hope I'm coming through here. The other thing is a philosophy or a vision statement. The city, which means the residents in all, will be deciding whether they want to remain a suburbia or become a small city. And this is going to be very interesting for reserves. I wrote down, there's a couple of people in the room know about a time capsule that's open up next year on the 25th, the silver anniversary of the city. And here's follow-up of what I just heard. The golden years will be 2049. And that brought up, you can't change the past. This is not my things. This is written all over, but you can't change the past, but you can live in the moment, which we are right now, and plan for the future. And using a personal pronoun, I'm not against planning for 2049 and have a great reserve.
I think Larry just had some great words of wisdom there that we could probably get some royalties off of in the future.
Steve,
Others, Michael, Christine, Richard?
Just what do we use? I'm sorry for understanding. What do we use the reserve for?
The reserves are intended to be that rainy day fund to be able to, so that to the extent that there is a recession or there is some other issue that occurs that that impacts your revenues, your resources to be able to provide services, that you can tap into those reserves. And that's typically how every agency pretty much looks at reserve. That's what they're used for. It's kind of like on a personal level, you have a certain amount of cash flow savings that you've done for your family, right? So make sure that if something happens, you become unemployed or something, you know, whatever, that you've got those monies to be able to pull back on. That's different than, of course, maybe the Christmas savings account that you might have. Say that again, I'm sorry.
Sorry, there's no restrictions on its use.
There's no, not unless the city has made a decision of how it's going to be used. One of the things that's a good thing practice is to talk about a policy where what would be an appropriate use to spend down reserves. You know, what times are those appropriate for one-time expenditures, for knowing that you've got to use that so that you can get yourself corrected for the future, those types of things. So anyways, Christine, looks like you're ready to grab the mic.
Yes, thank you. I have an operational question. With these recommendations looking out to 2034 for existing operations, nothing new added in here. What's the process, or what would be the operational process to revisit the model? I know what we're putting in place here is to be, you know, held in place for quite some time, but as new projects come on board or what have you, what's the operational process to revisit the forecast?
Yep, the forecast is math, and the numbers never sleep, and times change and things change. And so the concept is that this forecast and this model is being reviewed, you know, at least every biennium, hopefully every year, just to kind of, you know, take a fresh look at that. The problem though is that as we look here today, was it live in the moment today and where we're going for the future, is this is what the future holds or shows if we are comfortable and agree with the assumptions upon which they're based. So therefore, we need to figure out a pathway now to be able to address the gap that exists. And so will this whole big fiscal sustainability initiative that you all are part of today need to be revisited? Maybe, but not necessarily, if you fix the structural issue that exists here, which is this imbalance of the growth of revenues that you can rely on versus the growth of expenditures upon which services are provided. That helps. So will you have to do this again? You're going to have, the city is going to have to continue to revise its forecast and update it based on what's happening. So
I was going to say, you won't, we will.
yeah.
I think the goal, to answer your question, is that we would revisit this every year as part of the budget review. And that if and when we start to see revenue from, let's say, I don't know, town center coming in at levels where we're like, oh, that's a sustainable amount, we might adjust the forecast accordingly. And whatever plan comes out of this, we might say, oh, maybe you don't have to do that piece this year. We can wait on that, or whatever it might be. So it is designed to be a path forward that every year you would check in on, we would check in on and say, are we on do we still need to take this step? And if the answer is yes, then hopefully council would take action. And if we're seeing more, we would say, hey, we think we can pause a year on this and just revisit it next year. And maybe if, as my colleague says, if leprechauns come in and wave their magic wand and fix it all, great. We move forward.
Don, and then, yeah.
Yeah, one concern I have is that we cry wolf too loudly. In other words, we see that gap coming and we say, okay, we need 6% utility tax. Once you put a new tax in like that, it's going to be hard to get it back out. Councils aren't going to want to give it back up. And so in here, you say that we're going to ignore the town center for now. But the town center is a potential significant portion of solving the problem. And so if you ignore it now and we say, well, we have to have these taxes put in, or we've got this gap, then we might be doing it too soon, too much too soon. So that's why I wanted to better understand services and how we can modify those.
Yeah, yeah. I really want to talk about that. I do want to address the question that was on the table in terms of just, perspectives on this reserve threshold. Does anybody else have any other input in terms of, which of those dashed lines should we be planning for? Or is that a good, just, padding in which to plan for? Rich, did you want to chime in on that, or?
Inflation could end up being 2 to 3% rather than 4 to 5, and we may not know that for a couple of years, but that, would they roll back the utility taxes if inflation, was less than what, what we're assuming? Probably not, but also just another comment, I suppose, we were talking about, well, Sammamish doesn't have very much sales tax, so we're probably less vulnerable to a recession than most cities, certainly Bellevue and stuff, and since we get most of our money from property taxes, that's almost bulletproof recession, recession proof, I suppose. Because it would still, the valuation with the taxes could still go up the 1%. Not that we probably don't need to address this shortfall somehow, but there may be some assumptions that are higher, that are higher than maybe what'll actually happen here, the inflation. It seems like we're probably vulnerable to inflation because of the property tax, but less affected by a recession.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, you're right. And while this forecast assumes 4% as the inflationary impact for non-personnel costs and 5% above that, then there is that perspective as well. I want to make sure that we capture Julie, who's not in the room with us. And Mike, can you make sure that we can see Julie's lovely face here on screen? And so, Julie, did you have any input in terms of this reserve threshold question?
Yes, thank you. And I'm sorry I can't be with you there today. I am generally in favor of the higher reserve, the 25%. Looking at this graph, having a higher reserve allows these deficit years, allows the city to continue to provide the level of services that people expect. I think that's an important thing I wanted to find out more is like, what's the sentiment in Sammamish? I think I've heard a couple of things from other members that, people enjoy a high standard of living in Sammamish. And so, I guess the sentiment might be, and I don't know if this is true, and I don't know how the city surveys or knows that. I'd like to find out a little bit more about that. But then also, inflation, yes, may not go up as high, but with the contracts for fire and police, I think people in this city place a high value on safety and those types of services. And the city is, with those large contracts, those wages might be going up more than, inflation, or they may need to raise them in order to recruit. I saw that there's, issues with recruitment. So that's why I favor a higher reserve.
Got it. Thanks, Julie. Appreciate that input there. So, John?
As we're talking about both the reserve level and also the council's ability to make changes in taxes and fees, the council's easiest move is just to forego the 1% increase and bank it. I don't think we have any bank capacity right now, but if the city banks 2 or 3 years, that gives some actual reserve capacity. Have you modeled any of that in this, or we're projecting to take the 1% every year?
So the forecast right now is based on the assumption that the 1% is done every year. From for the council could choose to not do that, as you said, right? And that is potentially a way that, you know, the council could make a decision to mitigate some of the other strategies that might be implemented.
Exactly.
But I'm not sure to what extent does that then relate then to the reserve question? Is that what you're saying, or?
Well, a little bit, but I think the mitigation of, you know, if there's other new taxes or fees created, instead of trying to back off of those,
Hmm.
the council can easily forego the 1%.
Yeah. Yeah, that could be an option, right? Is look at a different revenue source, but on the other side, assume that the capacity is banked for the future for property tax. That's an option. Yeah.
One more comment, Steve, on reserve. I guess if we're kind of weighing in on this, I'm not understanding the higher reserve or even what that might be, because I don't understand the variation that we're up against. What I mean by that is that if this is a rainy day fund, the other things we're talking about, like paying for things escalating in price, that's all in the forecast. That shouldn't be the role of the reserve, I don't think. My understanding. I thought reserve was rainy day in case it's something's unexpected, but the other things we can all plan for. So therefore, if that high reserve is to account for us forecasting poorly, that's a whole nother question. And so having that all banked up, it's hard to say how, because we have to pay for that. We have to build that up somehow, right? And it's like, okay, well, that's no small feat. And then not knowing the gap that we're trying to close annually, I don't know what the effect of the green line to the blue line is in terms of gain annually, because we're not trying to, you know, it's a question. I know it's not a $40 million gap annually. It's what?
No, the gap is on the right-hand side. It's
5
4
million?
million that grows up to 21 million by the
Or,
time
yeah,
you hit
annually 4
2034.
million, right? So how much, if we go to the green line, are we affecting the annual effect is really what I'm thinking about. And then in terms of the reserve, I wonder about the volatility, what variability we have. If it's very little, then you don't need a huge reserve.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the ways that you could look at this reserve is kind of almost how it's painted, is that we want to try to target between a absolutely bare minimum, whatever that is, maybe it's 10%, but ideally 25%, and use that kind of as the planning tool in terms of addressing this gap. So therefore, maybe what you're trying to do is keep the red line, which is on the left side, which is your reserve level, try to manage it so that it's somewhere around and never falling under any circumstances below the blue line, but trying to manage it towards the green line. That's another way that some agencies will look at this reserve.
I have a feeling people are looking for concrete examples of what reserves might be used for, like a terrible storm. We've had unprecedented expenses with regards to storms that were not budgeted for. Though that's only predicted to get worse if I list what I'm listening to in the news. Storms, terrible economic dislocations, which we do not foresee now, which might require, what other things would be disasters that would cause us to dip into a reserve that we do want our city and our residents to be protected from? Storms is certainly one. You know, I want the trees, earthquakes. We have, you know, these are things we want. We want trees removed from the road, right? And that's not that we don't just pay overtime to do that out of the general fund. I mean, we need more money for those kinds of things. And it sure would be comforting to know that the money is there to do that. What other kinds of things? Scott, you can use your imagination.
Wildfires, I think, are a very
Wildfires.
reasonable assumption. If there's some type of event where we would have to use a whole lot of overtime to deal with the aftermath of something like that, that would be something that we would definitely not have budgeted in, and we would have to pull out of reserves. For instance, if there was a very large settlement of some kind that we didn't account for. Some pieces the city self-insures itself for, public records being one of them. So if there's a very large settlement that we didn't see coming, that would have to come out of reserves. So there's multiple different things. Or if we had some version of a failure at a facility that required a major investment that we didn't have pre-budgeted for, that's also something that would require dipping into reserves. So it's essentially, Michael, to your point, it is totally fungible dollars. And by that, I mean, it's just straight general fund money, but we would have to come to council and say, here's what we need and here's why, and council would have to approve it in order to use it. So there's a lot of different things, and I'm sure Aaron, our finance director, could come through with a few more, but that's the start of a list.
Yeah, the one thing I was going to add is the consideration for the cash. You mentioned cash as part of your cash flow forecast. So for the city being property tax, we collect property taxes not until April. It's the first time we receive those from King County. So you're going 4 months into the year before you get that. So just from a cash flow perspective, if you're looking on an annualized basis, you want to be able to have that cash on hand to pay for operations.
Yeah, just to that point, I was working with an agency in California that had a reserve target of 7.5% of annual operating expenditures. And when they ended up having some recessionary impacts, it's no wonder that they ended up having to issue every year, like clockwork, tax anticipation notes to be able to carry them forward, because they literally did not have enough cash flow to be able to make good on the next 3 months of payroll and the services they've purchased from other providers. So you don't want it to get so low that you're going to start having, an impact with respect to cash reserves.
Yeah, but we collect them in October, so it's not, you have, if you look at it yearly like that. Yeah, it's from October, so it's not like you're going 4 months without, you
Right.
collect them in October to get you through to April, right? Yeah, yep.
Use the mic so Julie can.
It's actually collected twice a year. So it's collected in April and October. So you go the first 4 months of the year without any tax revenue. You get your first payment of tax revenue.
I
and then
I
you
will
get
say that
the second one in October.
deciding on what the reserve threshold will be isn't necessarily the same thing as the cash flow thing. Totally get that. But the lower that you allow reserves to get, the more difficult it's going to be able to ensure that you have the right cash flow for those lumpy revenue sources that come in, right? And that's really what the point is, Mike. But you're absolutely right. It's not the same as the cash flow projection. That's not the same. So, yeah. Let's move into the strategies if we can, and with the rest of the report. So what we've done is we've got eye candy up here so that we can look at if there's any questions on them, but I really want to kind of take them in groups. And the way that we had analyzed the different strategies was based on some different categories, which we had talked with you about before: expenditure controls and cost shifts, service delivery changes, revenue enhancements. Those are the three that are trying to maintain service levels to the fullest extent possible in a fiscal sustainability exercise. And to the extent that those do not manifest themselves timely enough or are not sufficient to be able to address the gap, then you'll have to look at service level reductions. And so the first area is this area of expenditure controls and cost shifts. And there were three in that area that looked at number one, which is implementing a solid waste franchise fee. I know that sounds like a revenue enhancement, but it's a way to be able to shift the cost that you're dealing with in terms of roadways to the solid waste provider, understanding that ultimately that gets flown through into the fees that are on your bill as a garbage customer, if you will. The second is to look at improving public safety through traffic enforcement technology as an option that will help provide resources to be able to pay for the public safety services that you have. And there's some nuances, of course, with each of these. And then the third is to eliminate vacant law enforcement officer positions. Those are the ones that are currently vacant. They're not filled at the present time. So therefore, it's not a reduction in service from what is currently in place today, although it's probably not ideal of where you wanted to be to begin with. But those three are some different strategies that we identified in the work that we did in this area. Are there any questions about those before we get to the next category, or we can, I just kind of want to address top level kind of questions or feedback that you have. I don't want to evaluate whether it makes sense to do it or not. We're going to have time to do that. But I do want to just kind of understand whether or not you have any questions about the strategies themselves. Don, are you grabbing the mic to a question? Yeah.
Yeah, on the law enforcement officer positions, I know when we annexed Klahani, we went from, I believe, 2 shifts to 3 shifts. And the question is, with the 2 vacant officers, how is that affecting operations?
Yeah. Scott, do you want to address that on behalf of the chief that's not here?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think they're managing operations with overtime from other, we are running 3 shifts consistently, but we are pulling overtime from other King County agencies to come fill in when necessary. So if we have everybody in place where we can staff it, if someone's out sick or on vacation, we pull in extra resources.
Larry?
Thank you. The way that it reads 2 different ways. There to eliminate the vacant law enforcement officer's position is to hire 2 more people to fill them. That's how you eliminate them. Is fill the positions. And I think
Larry's going to help us draft the report, you guys, to Scott. Yeah. Anyways, go ahead.
One of the things, and it isn't so much of reserve, it's society and safety. And I think this, the public is going to have a lot of input in. Well, we're pretty safe now. We have awards. We have records of being a safe city. Is this something we're going to budget for?
Go ahead.
I have a
Debbie.
quick question about this franchise fee. So can that also be applied to other users of our infrastructure? And I'm speaking specifically of Cadman sending full cement trucks at 50 miles an hour down the East Lake Sammamish Parkway every day, and wondering, because we don't have any way of capturing a way to maintain that road, and I'm sure it's having an impact. So is that something you could apply a franchise fee to?
Go ahead. So some examples from some other agencies. You haven't put a drawbridge down yet to not allow people to come through without paying? No toll bridges? No.
Don't give any ideas.
No. There have been opportunities that we've seen in other agencies to, I call them a tipping fee, but it's basically for the large vehicles, trucks that are putting an impact on roadway. The issue becomes, though, how do you know who's coming through and whatnot? And you can do the studies in terms of understanding what the degradation of the roadway is and the fees that would be necessary for that. But it's a real tough thing to be able to, how do you prevent people from, using public roadways, right? So, but Scott, go ahead.
I was just going to make the nexus between the fact that the utility has the franchise to operate in town, and they tend to have the heaviest trucks around. And so I think the connection is because they have that franchise to be out on the roads all day, every day, 6 days a week, that there's a direct correlation. So that's why there's an actual, a more direct nexus, if you will.
Christine, and then John.
For the two law enforcement positions, were those two new roles or are those roles being backfilled?
They're not new. The short answer is that there's a nationwide law enforcement shortage, and we in this area are not immune to it. And so they're just positions that we can't fill. We can't find people to fill them. So.
Go ahead, John.
Just a reminder that we don't fill those vacant law enforcement positions now for savings. They could be filled in the future if the budget's there or the demand's there.
They're not filled. Yeah, that's right. Yep.
I feel that, since we are making comments on these at this point, I feel that with the increasing population, we're only going to need more officers in town center and then changing up the population and people's activities and values are only going to mean we're going to need more law enforcement. People highly do value safety. I do have a question about the traffic cameras. Don't we already have cameras at the bottom of Inglewood Hill Road? No, we don't. Okay. So heck, cameras. We did have some issues with cameras in parks. People didn't like the idea. They felt it invaded their privacy. I don't know, it's a public road. I'm also thinking maybe the receipts decrease with time as people learn that there's a camera there and I better not go through that red light. Do you find that to be the case?
Go ahead.
No.
No, really? Okay.
You'd be amazed. I am obligated by my staff to point out that you have to define a clear need for a public safety need for the cameras before you can implement them. So it's not just that we could put them out there, it's that we would have to prove that there is, whether it's collisions or, near misses or whatever it is, pedestrian versus car, we can't just put them out there as a revenue source. So it's a little bit of a higher cliff to climb, if you will.
Well, you're making money and you're making people safer then, right? I mean, how can you?
It's the goal is as the safety goal, like you have to be able to show that you've reduced that traffic, whatever that traffic issue is, as part of it. And the other pieces we just need to keep in mind is that there is a administrative cost that is not inconsequential that goes with the administration of every one of those red light camera tickets you get. An officer has to review them and approve that being sent out. So you are one of those new police positions would be to administer the red light camera program. So, like with all things, nothing's free.
Yeah. And we took into those in consideration, those costs
Okay.
and the net impact. So, yeah. Good, Rich.
So the unfilled 2 police officer positions, I guess we're paying the county sheriff $486,000 for that. And we're not using that. We're not able to use that for the overtime, right? That's just money out the window kind of.
No, it is being, obviously the dollars are there for, we're just not using all the overtime, if that makes sense.
Okay. So we're not paying for the 2 officers to the King County Sheriff and then having the backfill from whatever the general fund to pay that, right?
Right,
Okay,
correct,
okay.
correct.
I did have another comment on the franchise fee there. There's some verbiage in here says fees can be used for city provided education and outreach, waste reduction. But it also says franchise fees revenues are unrestricted and it may be used for any government purpose. And that's probably how we would use them, I would think, rather than, education or something. Okay.
Mike, you're watching if Julie has any, since I can't see her. So, okay. Okay, good. Okay, great. Should we move on to the next category? Okay, so we'll move on to the next category, which is, I believe, revenue enhancements. We've separated these into 2 areas. One is councilmanic. That's a Washingtonian word. That means that the council has the authority to move forward with those revenue options. for the most part. And then there's ones that require voter approval. And so there were 6 different revenue enhancement strategies that came up as it related to councilmanic revenue enhancements, utility tax, and emissions tax, primarily on golf course, the B&O, business occupation tax. Transportation benefit district, you're going to see these in a couple of different areas because the council can move forward with a TBD of up to ratably up to $40. And then after a while, you can then go up to that final $50 level. So that's why we've just captured it with that. But there's different gradations in all of this that I want to make sure we all understand. Increasing the business license fee, and where, you know, the B&O tax is really the one that would potentially, you know, generate some additional revenues. The license fee is more of an administrative type of a fee. And then finally is this concept of economic development strategies to increase retail sales tax. I want to be clear about that one, because I know I saw some questions about that, is that it's not solely focused on just the town center. It's meant to be a comprehensive economic development strategy within the entire community. And to that point, I think, Don, you had mentioned it a little earlier about the town center and to what extent have those revenues or not been included in the forecast. We have not assumed any significant development for the future. I understand from staff, and you're going to hold me accountable here if I miss this, but I think there's one project that has been kind of working through the approval process. And I believe it's for 10 single family homes and 20 or 30-ish multifamily townhomes. And that is what's moving forward right now. And it's hopeful that those will be in place by 2026, I think is the time frame that's currently being discussed. Somebody in here knows the town center.
I'm gonna look at Christine because she is she works with that company that is doing that.
I don't want to put
development.
you on the spot, Christine, but just, you know, just to understand, is that right?
We're hopeful to break ground this year, but yes, it's down the road that those would be available for purchase, those
Got it.
residential units. Yeah.
Yeah. I know there's a discussion about perhaps some additional, you know, apartment units perhaps that could be in the future and whatnot. And I think just, you know, I think there was a comment made about, you know, back of the envelope, and I think we even maybe mentioned it at the last meeting. Until which time that an agency sees that there is a plan in place and that, you know, it has gone through the entitlement requirements, it's kind of hard for a finance person to be able to start pulling that into a forecast as something that you can expect and count on that's going to be there. But and there's 2 elements with respect to the town center development as well as just development in general that you look at. One is what are the one-time revenues that could be generated, right? And that's the above ground assessed valuation that will be constructed that ends up finding its way into the city's coffers as the use tax portion of sales and use tax. That's a construction tax, if you will, right? And then so there's that one time, as well as the impact fees that might be associated with park impact fees, transportation impact fees, et cetera. So you get those one-time fees that come on. But what then really, in terms of this exercise that we're going through, is what is the ongoing revenues that can be generated? And primarily, for the most part, it comes down to 2 big buckets, which is property tax and sales tax. By way of reference, and somewhat Owen with your question about, you know, property tax and that whole 1% growth and all that jazz. Your current tax rate, your levy rate, is 97 cents per $1,000. And so how much would it take to generate, let's say, $1 million of additional ongoing property taxes each year? It would take close to about $1 billion of construction above ground. Okay. And just, you know, if again, using some numbers in the air, let's assume that a single family home can be built for $500,000. Some people might build it for 2 million, but let's just assume it's 500,000. If I remember my math right, it would take 2,000 single-family residential units to construct to provide assessed valuation of $1 billion that would translate into $1 million of property tax revenue to the city of Sammamish each year. Yeah, the other jurisdictions would love to see that as well, the school district and all the ones that we talked about before. But that's the numbers that we're talking about here, y'all. And so go ahead, John. And I wanted to mention the sales tax piece as well, but go ahead.
Well, just quickly on the economic development, as part of the comp plan update, there is an element for economic development in the current planning stages. So that would tie in with that element that you've identified.
Yeah. Did you? And then on the sales tax side, how much will it take to be able to generate, significant retail? As much as we love our neighborhood restaurants and they're great and wonderful opportunity, restaurants by and large might generate maybe $50,000 a year in terms of sales tax. If it's a really good restaurant and it's working pretty well. Yeah, your bigger ones, like Cheesecake Factory when it was a real big thing, and others, they might, generate a little bit more. I will just say a big box retailer that has fuel that it also sells that generates sales tax for a local community could generate upwards to about $1.5 to $2 million a year. That's where your big revenues come from. Or large shopping centers with a significant number of good, thriving retailers in them, could start generating, 200, 300, 500,000. But you can start seeing with the $18 million gap that we see in the forecast, how many big box stores does it take to be able to, solve the gap. So anyway, Town Center is a great development. I've had a chance to kind of drive through it and we talked about it a little bit earlier and I was able to see it with my own eyes, which is awesome. Just that whole area. But how much development can we really expect in that 240 acres? Is that about right? In the whole Town Center area? That could generate the significant revenues that you need to be able to address the gap. So that's kind of been our take on in terms of that. So those revenues are not on the forecast because until which time that we see that their entitlements are in place and construction permits are pretty close to being issued or expected to be issued. Our professional independent opinion is that you don't assume that that's there. And if it is there, that's where every biennium, we're taking another fresh look at the forecast and revisiting that. So anyway, that's my thought on that. Economic development is very valuable. It's very important that you can see what the magnitude is that's going to be necessary to be able to address the city's projected financial gap. Debbie, you were motioning?
Yeah, I really appreciate that analysis. And that doesn't even take into account the increased service demand that would be created at the same time. You're assuming that we could support that at the same level of staffing and growth that we're building into the model. So, I mean, by the time you get done with netting that, it's a very difficult way to raise the money. But in reading the materials, well, first of all, and with all due respect to the Town Center, I don't put all my eggs in that basket. I really don't. We have existing shopping centers here that could go multi-story, that could expand, that could provide the other kinds of retail opportunities we want in the city. And so I'm curious, have you done any kind of assessment on just the existing retail that we have and what could we do to promote better results from them?
Thank you, Debbie. I appreciate the question. I think for the purposes of this exercise, that's not what we had asked them to do. I think to John's point, as we look at the comp plan process and we're doing the economic development component, I think that's one of the questions is what could happen in those areas that's not happening now. But that's for the purposes of actually looking at projections about what we can count on and realistically put in a model. That's a fairly large unknown. And it's a lot farther away. So we're kind of constricted by what we can really say, yes, that's going to happen. And so to Steve's point about town center, we're working through that, and we're working with all the applicants in town center. But even once you get a viable permit, you can sit on that for, once you're vested, you have a fair number of years that you can sit on that permit before you would have to move forward on it before it expires. So even if you get that permit until earth starts being turned, that's when you know that it's going to be for real. And prior to that point, it is up to the developer to decide whether or not, or the owner to decide whether or not they want to move forward. So we have to be a little bit cautious about what we're counting on. So I do anticipate adjusting the model just for the rest of the group as we go, as things come online and permits progress through the process, we will start to adjust based on what we're seeing. So I think that's.
Since we're talking about retail, there was a little bit written in the report about online sales. Just, can we capture more tax from online sales?
So there have been some movements in that space because of a decision that I forget what circuit it was, Supreme Court issued regarding where is the place of sale, where does that take place? And so some of the online sales have been very helpful in terms of generating additional sales tax revenue. I don't believe, and Aaron, I might need to call on you on this, I don't believe that there is the potential that where your humongous online sales source, where their warehouse is located, has any impact on that tax, does it?
No, it's destination-based sales tax for Washington. So
Right. So no matter where the warehouse is located, it's all based on where the goods are shipped, and that's where the sales tax gets applied.
So I had a follow-up question to that.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Julia.
Yeah. Just my question on that was whether, in the finance people from the city would be able to maybe tell us this. Did you see a measurable increase in the sales tax, right, during the pandemic when people were ordering online? Do you see that leveling off or dropping off? What's the activity there?
Sure, Aaron, if Aaron has a.
yes, we did. So actually during the pandemic particularly, we were tracking that carefully because we were concerned of less consumption, if that would mean something for us. And locally, the sales tax, actually, we had increases during the pandemic period because, as you probably all experienced, more people were delivering goods to the residences and weren't going remote outside of the city and making those sales outside, which that local sales tax piece would go to wherever that store is located in that case. But instead they were having more remote of those online sales and having things delivered. And so when they had them delivered, that's the local jurisdiction that where that delivery occurred would get that local sales tax piece. So Sammamish actually experienced a little bit of an increase in the sales tax collections as a result. And that's sustained. We haven't seen that drop off as well. That's continues, that pattern that we initially saw a rise in during those pandemics has continued on.
And so in your model, do you assume that it's, at a level now that's kind of sustainable, or what's the assumption?
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and toss it back over to. So we looked at that, particularly the sales tax collections, and adjusted up for that level of activities, that increased level of activities that we were seeing. So that's in the current model estimates that we were looking at.
Thank you.
This is a game that cities play all across the United States where there's sales taxes. Let's see how we can capture sales tax from somebody else. Let's just go ahead and annex that part of Issaquah that has a Costco in it. No, they play these games and try to find ways to get them to move into the community. And ultimately, online versus brick and mortar sales, it's really just about what can the community generate in terms of a place, a place to shop, a place to do business. And also, you know, some cities have actually done this huge campaign to encourage their community to, instead of, you know, going down across the border, just have it shipped to your house. So that way you can collect the sales tax revenue in that community. So anyways. All right. Any other questions, thoughts on these councilmanic revenue enhancements?
How realistic is it to think we could recommend increasing taxes?
The which one? I'm sorry, the utility.
Any of them?
Ah, okay. Would we recommend or no? Oh. We recommend that the gap be solved. We've identified some strategies. I will tell you that, you know, I will say that there's no silver bullets here, you guys. There's no silver bullets. The closest you come, but it comes with some pain, is this utility tax. That's the one that has the potential to generate the most significant revenue. But you need to understand is that while council can make a decision to implement that in Washington state based on case law and state statutes, any utility tax is subject to a referendum. And there have been a few communities that we've been working with that have tried to move forward with a utility tax and have determined that, well, it's a no-go. So, but that's not to say that it's not a potential solution. The key with any of these type of tax measures, whether it's councilmanic or not, it's this concept of partnership. It's partnering with the community to determine what level of services and what the priority of services are that they want to have, and to what extent are they willing to pay for those services vis-a-vis something like a utility tax. So there you go. John, go ahead.
So just as a general comment, our problem with taxes is that there's not a clear link between what you're paying and what you're getting. It's not like going to the corner store with your nickel and getting a piece of bubble gum.
For general tax, right? Yeah.
Right. So, well, like the transportation benefit district, in my mind, is easier to explain in the sense that that money would be going to pay for road maintenance and improvements. Trying to close that gap between what you're paying for and what you're getting versus just dumping stuff into the general fund and hoping that concerts in the park come out the other end.
Larry, go ahead.
But we try to share.
And then Don.
Okay, I was gonna say it's clear that the utility tax generates the most potential revenues, and in particular, option 2, which is including water and sewer, gets you estimated 11 million a year. And it would seem that if we have this huge nut to crack, we're pretty well required to take the utility tax. Now, property tax, you don't have a lot of option as a property owner to change that unless you're a senior and a certain income level. But with utilities, you can control the utility use. And in fact, that is also more environmentally viable if you control the usage of electricity and water. So there is some flexibility in that. So I am supportive of, if we have to crack the nut, I'm supportive of option 2 of the utility tax.
Okay.
I also am opposed to the business and occupation taxes. I feel that most of the businesses we have are home-based, and the more paperwork we put on them, the less appealing it is. If we're a community that supports home-based business and encourages it, that's in our benefit. So my thought on the B&O tax.
Okay. Thank you, Larry.
Okay. Thank you. I might be a lone ranger on this, but number 7, the $20 a vehicle fee raises $1 million per year. However, it's obligated for transportation, which follows along with what Don just said. It's where, and Scott too, it's related to it's your vehicle, but you're going to get a transportational improvement, hopefully. It's not retrograde. It shouldn't have too much impact on income, lower incomes. The thing that I do notice, it can be implemented anytime by the city council without a vote. They happen to be on hiatus right now in August, but would been, maybe they could come in and do that. That's about all.
Thank you. Again, I'm not necessarily looking for thumbs up or thumbs down with any of these, just more of just, trying to get perspectives, but I appreciate you sharing kind of where you're coming from. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, just clarification. Steve, you said that the utility tax might require a referendum or vote. Do any of the others? Because when I heard Councilmanic, I thought that meant that city council could decide any of those. Did I misunderstand that?
So if your question wasn't, forgive me, it may be by hearing, but why is it shown on the Councilmanic list?
No, I think I can grab this one.
Go ahead.
Steve. Michael, I
Sorry.
appreciate the question. Excuse me. Councilmanic means yes, council can take action without a vote of the people, but the utility tax has a referendum piece where if the community decided that they didn't like that, they could gather signatures and require it to be put on the ballot and have it be pulled. So
But isn't this a point of education? I mean, if people are told why we're doing this and it's explained to the citizenry in a understandable way, that the chances of a referendum decline significantly. So that's our job, that's the council's job, that's the city's job to make this understandable. So that doesn't happen,
Yeah.
right?
Good. Next category. So Sam, if you wouldn't mind, we'll move over to the voter approved or required
Steve.
voter approval enhancements.
Steve, can I do a quick pause here?
Yeah.
Can we do we need a 5-minute stretch your legs break? Or is everyone good to go? Continue on. Is that okay?
You want to take a break?
Just a 5-minute
Sure,
stretch your
yeah,
legs?
absolutely, yeah. So
Yeah.
we'll reconvene at, well, let's just say 7:50, 7:50. It's close to 5 minutes. I've always wanted to say this. Avengers assemble. Oh, okay. FST Avengers assemble. Come on, there's got to be at least one Avengers fan in here. Please tell me there's at least one. Nobody likes the Avengers. Anybody ever seen the Avengers? Okay, good. That's all right. Thank you, Michael. I was saying Avengers assemble. I could have gone dark and said tributes assembled, and that gets really gets dark. All right. So we were talking about the voter approved revenue enhancements, and they range from property tax levy lid lift that could be either done for a general or specific purpose to a TBD that's above that councilmanic level, because you could actually go up between $51 and $100, but that requires voter approval. A Metropolitan Park District as an option to help deal with parks and recreation activities and parks operations and maintenance, as well as then there's a fourth one. This is the concept of issuing general obligation bonds to fund capital needs. We felt an obligation to include this in here. It doesn't do anything really with respect to being able to address your existing needs, but it could help if the interest rate market was good enough to be able to perhaps advance fund some projects. But we wanted to just make sure it was at least included and captured in there as a potential strategy. So any questions about these? I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussion perhaps.
Quick question on the obligation bonds. How do we repay that?
The general obligation bonds?
Yes.
By the full faith and credit of the
Okay.
city of Sammamish. Typically, yes, that's why they're called GO bonds. So it's a general obligation. Now, some agencies will find a way to pledge some revenues towards it, but those become a different type of bond. That becomes more of a revenue bond. That's a different beast. So, yeah. Go ahead, John.
So for the general obligation bonds, aside, the more specific would be, say, a parks and open space bond with an accompanying levy lift for maintenance.
That,
Right?
yes, that is, yeah, that's one of the options, yes, for the use of that. But again, remember, there would be a quote unquote dedicated revenue source from that perspective to deal with that. So, but a typical GO bond is really a general obligation of the agency from its existing revenue sources. So. And again, the property tax levy lid lift, as you read in here, it's not do it once and it's forever. It's got a limited duration period. And so it would need to be, if it was assumed to be an ongoing strategy, it would need to be re-upped every how many years that the measure is put forward to voters. I think the maximum period is 8 years, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, that's the timing that you have with that. Okay, any questions about those?
Question.
Yeah, Julie.
Could you explain just how the Metropolitan Park District, the transferring costs from the Park District from the city ops, how that works? I don't think I quite understood that.
Yeah, let me give you general concept of it. I know Rachel has actually had some experience, I believe, in dealing with an MPD, but conceptually what this does is it creates a different taxing entity that you can use to be able to oversee and manage your parks and in some cases recreation operations, as well as maintenance and then infrastructure. And so what the council would need to do is to establish a district, an area, if you will, and then decide who they want to have on that separately elected body. And that body would then have the opportunity to be able to levy a tax on homeowners. The issue here, though, is that the way it benefits the city of Sammamish is that it would find a new revenue source to be able to directly address parks and recreation needs in the community, as well as to possibly provide a separate funding source for some of the things that are on the Parks Master Plan and some of the other, capital needs that have. And Rachel, did you want to come up here and address any additional insight that you have on this?
Thank you. So I think for the most part, Steve, that you got it. I just want to say that MPDs were created by the state, seeing, right, that the 1% issue has really hampered parks. A lot of what you have in front of you, right, were things that were created by the state to say, okay, we know that this 1% issue is here. So how can we find other ways to provide other revenue? And that's exactly what the MPDs are for, is to be able to hold parks harmless. So there are 25, I believe, MPDs throughout the state, and this is a resource that is available to this community if that's something that they would want to do.
Julie, did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. That was great.
Can you tell us what the negatives and the positives are of those?
Sure. I mean, the first thing is that it's more property tax. That's the big negative, right? Is that you would be, an MPD has up to 75 cents per thousand. So I think what we modeled was much less than the 75 cents, sorry. But that is the big negative. The big negative is it's increased property taxes for the community. The positive is you have a dedicated revenue source just for parks and for recreation and for maintenance and all of those other things. So that's the positive.
Are there any issues with, I like to think the city people all working together, right? And so is there any negative in that respect?
There doesn't have to be. So the way it works is you create a special purpose district. And so for the sake of argument, let's just say that the city of Sammamish were to do it and it would be contiguous with the borders of Sammamish, right? What happens is you can set it up where the city council actually is the commission and they're the commissioners. So a council meeting is over, they gavel the council meeting closed, and then they gavel the meeting of the commission open. What that structure allows you to do is really share resources in some ways. So the MPD could then contract with the city. I know this sounds a little bit weird, but really the MPD contracts with the city in order to provide the services. So you have that seamless structure. So I live in a city that has an MPD. City of Seattle, we created an MPD 5 or 6 years ago. You would never know that the city and the MPD are different entities in any way, shape, or form. The parks are all Seattle parks, right? The recreation programs are all through Seattle. It is simply another funding source. Now, there is another way to do it. You can jettison the commission, the board, to be its own government entity. Happen to have some experience with that too. Tukwila did that, right? So they created a MPD just for the pool. And then the council is actually not the commission. They have a separately elected commission. That can create more of that kind of disconnect, Nancy, that you're concerned about. If I were to do an MPD, I would keep it as all in one family.
great insights. Thanks, Rachel.
So I
Question-
just,
Question.
yeah, go ahead, Don.
So as I understand it, then the MPD wouldn't be subject to a limitation of 7 years or 8 years or anything like that. So that's the advantage of it over a levy, property tax levy.
Absolutely, it's permanent.
And the other question is it subject to the 1% each year?
Yes, but you have up to 75 cents per thousand on an MPD. And that's a significant amount of money. You wouldn't hit that
So
unless,
if you start at 14 cents, you can increase it, you can double it the next year. In other words, you can track inflation with that.
Mhm.
And we are proud of our parks, and we expanded them over the life of our city enormously, and we want good maintenance. So this does make a lot of sense for Sammamish.
Just one other quick thing, just structurally, the TBD is structured in the same exact way as the MPD. So it's not a separate entity, it's just a separate way to do funding source for specific things.
If
Larry.
correct what Scott just said, then this would not take away any of the local governance of the parks staff and recreation department. And I think would be a big selling point. This is maybe not a silver bullet, but it's starting to look like one. And within this room, there's a lot of people that have some very direct contact and interest in parks.
Nobody caught the
you have
side
some
eye there,
background
so.
John, what do you think?
Well, anytime we're going to increase taxes, it's going to be problematic. But the fact that either the TBD or the MPD could work, it's just, it's a way to make it work for the city and for the community. And we'd have to figure out how to communicate that and make it clear what's going on. I mentioned earlier to Scott that Fiscal actually implemented a park district that encompassed part of Sammamish in the 90s, actually in the 80s, I think, but eventually abandoned it. So, if we're going to see something through like that, we're going to have to dedicate it. Nancy's looking at me very closely as the chair of the Parks Commission.
What is better, a parks bond and issue and
Well, maybe-
capital needs and for support, or a TBD or a MP? What is it? It's an MPD.
For the park district for ongoing operations, probably better park bond and maybe accompanying levy lift for acquisition of new development of parks rather than trying to use that money as operational funding because it has a sunset date. Whereas if you passed a bond for open space, which usually those are pretty popular, it's a way to protect your community in your backyard. But it would be the park bond would be for a very specific purpose. Improve a ball field, buy some open space, whatever.
Any other questions, thoughts on this set of strategies? Finally is, again, remember that those first three categories were attempting to maintain service levels to the fullest extent possible. Service level reductions, of course, are the byproduct of not having enough strategies to be able to be reliable or timely enough to be able to address it. And so you might have to look at reduction. One that's a specific item that's on here is that middle one, which is reduce funded officers in the police services contract. So that's one option. It was harder to do that on the fire side, just given, I always call fire service lumpy, in that, unless you decide to brown out a station or brown out an apparatus, as they call it, which means either reduce a number of days and reduce a number of shifts or just eliminate it. It's hard to do that on a percentage scale. You would have to make decisions to brown out, and there's really no opportunity to really be able to do that sufficiently here and still have the coverage that you need in terms of medical response and fire response. But when it comes to, and let me just finish these two and then we'll go around, but the other ones are really more of, the general fund would be required to then reduce service levels or services to fill whatever portion of the structural gap that's not addressed by the other ones. And, with the budget that you have, you're spending about, I think it's 18 million-ish, I forget, for, it's not in front of me, for police and fire contracts, and then several of the other types of services that you're providing are contracted. It leaves pretty much about 42 million. And so a 10% reduction in the rest of that non-public safety funding would generate, 4.2 million. But let's face it, where's it going to come from? It's going to come from people, positions primarily, or contracted services that would reduce the level of service within the community. And so, there's these are all tough, of course. And the last one, really, you can't do that. You take no action. There are communities that have done that, and they have had to file for bankruptcy, and then they hire different people from our firm to help them through bankruptcy. City of Stockton, California, City of San Bernardino, I could go on, but I mean, that's the impact of an agency not getting ahead of this and addressing it, and it's catastrophic to the community, and that community will not look like what it looked like when it went into that whole thing. And so, frankly, take no action is not an option. It's got to be, one of the other two, or a series of different strategies that would really reduce those services. And we talked about, would there be services that would be eliminated? There might be, yeah. And this is the concept of really doing this, really taking a look at your services, and if push comes to shove and you need to do this, you would need to really understand them in terms of a prioritization, or kind of what are the essential services that are being provided versus those that are not as essential. And then decision makers would need to start making decisions about what are you going to lop off. And so instead, we frame this in terms of understanding that of a $42 million non-public safety budget, 10% of that, what would that look like, and what would that include, and what would you be doing? Would it be across the board, or would it be looking at different services? Ultimately, the city would need to make some choices in terms of what it will fund and what it will no longer fund to deal with that. So with that, Don, you were going to get a point.
I was just going to say about fire, Eastside Fire and Rescue started out as a unique partnership of 3 cities and 2 fire districts, and the charge per partner was based entirely on assessed valuation of property. And over the years, Sammamish grumbled until we said, hey, that's not entirely fair. There should be call volume included. And so we threatened to start our own department, and out of that, we came to an agreement, funding formula, which included call volume. But I don't know where that's at right now. Whether we're getting our fair share of service for our fair share of charges. So there might be a possibility there for some renegotiating the contract.
Yeah, but that's not from the perspective of insourcing or taking it back, right? That's not where you're going with that, or are you?
Well, that's a possibility.
As an option. Yeah, we, oh gosh, cities of Shoreline, Maple Valley, Kenmore did not. But Shoreline had done a contracted a study to look at insourcing, taking it back from KCSO, taking back police services, and the cost to get that running and to operate that with all the technology that would be needed, and equipment and all that stuff. It was just so exorbitant that they're just like, there's no way that this could make sense. Now, that said, ultimately, though, you have to realize that when you look at insourcing public safety, and we've seen a couple of agencies do that actually with work that we've done across the country, they've done it because the large agency that was caring for them got so large that their compensation and benefits plans were so prohibitive that they just, couldn't afford that anymore. And so they decided to insource that. They paid less, but they were at least able to find the people to be able to work there. Unfortunately, what they found is that the officers and the lieutenants and the sergeants and whatnot, it was kind of a training ground, and that they would go somewhere else for higher compensation and benefits packages. So it's not insurmountable, but there are some significant roadblocks, and that's one of the reasons why we did not incorporate that as a strategy. So, any other thoughts on these areas?
One for Scott.
Or
to-
perspectives?
to-
Go ahead, Debbie.
To respond to maybe. So my understanding, and you can educate us all on it, is that we do a lot of outsourcing, not just police and fire, that we have fewer staff, fewer FTEs, because we rely a lot on outside consultants for projects and work. And I just wonder, are we at a size now where we would be better off hiring people for those roles instead of outsourcing to consultants? And my experience with consultants is that it can be iffy.
Present company excluded or included.
Exactly. It can be iffy, and it takes a lot of management to be sure you're getting what you're paying for. So I'm just curious how you feel about that comparison of an FTE versus a consultant. And Steve, your opinion of it would be welcome too.
The key is really sizing the staffing so that they're able to deal with and address the service that's being contracted. Landscape maintenance, median maintenance is a great example because a lot of agencies have done that, and they found that that when they insourced those services, they spent more, but what they did is it gave capacity for those people to be able to address other issues that were going on, like storm management and other things like that. The benefit that you get from insourcing is, well, from a cost perspective, let me start there. You really have to look at what is the benefit structure of a local government agency versus the private sector. And the private sector typically does not have the same level of overhead in terms of health benefits and pension and all the other things that local agencies do. That said, you lose control now. And to Scott's point earlier, I think when he was talking about that, can you reasonably have the reliable services that you need from a contractor to be able to do that? And so some agencies have decided to insource those back and bring those back in. So that's kind of just the overall what we've seen. But Scott, you want to reflect?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. This is always, anytime we would look to add FTE counts, we would take a hard look at whether or not that makes sense, is the short answer to your question. And it would really be, would we be bringing a service in-house, or would it be a person? Because if we were to bring a person in, we would have to be able to demonstrate inspection services, something like that, that the demand is consistently there, versus if we have spikes, can we cover that with consultants, versus what is a steady demand, and where we could say, yes, we have that demand and we can cover it year over year because we know it's going to be there. So there's a lot of factors that go into that. It's not just maybe we should or maybe we shouldn't, because anytime, it's not only just then you're raising the base budget to account for a permanent FTE, but then it's also someone's livelihood, and you're talking about a person when you bring them in the door. There's a different level of commitment. So all those things factor into how we would make decisions about adding or asking for new FTEs.
Larry,
Steve,
go ahead.
back to your strategy, take no action. sorry, but in the realm of communication, to not communicate is still communicating. Therefore, to take no action is an action. And it, it might be nice to leave it there for the public to understand, and we can educate them on that. That's, it isn't just brushing it aside. It's we decided to not take any action. Okay.
Yeah. And it raises the point that you really, as a community, you lose control. Because who was in control of the city of Stockton and San Bernardino, the two examples that I gave that our firm helped through bankruptcy protection, it was the creditors. They were the ones that were in control. It wasn't the community anymore. And their decisions of how they were going to provide services and who was going to provide service and what level was taken out of their hands. So you're absolutely right. Point well taken. Nancy, were you going to?
They sell property. I mean, we have 660 acres of property we could sell.
Sell property?
Sell property, you could.
Yeah. So
Sell
so
some
the
of our favorite parks. I mean, this is what cities get into, right?
yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
You're right. And to that point, some people, say, well, how come, city might have some surplus property? Why not list that as a strategy? We're trying to address an ongoing gap. I just want to address this point. But we're trying to address an ongoing gap, and one-time revenues deal with one-time issues that you need to take care of. Unless that property is completely surplus, it's not just sitting there rotting, not being used for anything, and there's a revenue generating option by which that property can be used. Then now you're talking. There's some potential strategies there, but we did not include that as a strategy at all. So that point. But anyways, I want to briefly then touch on the scenarios that were developed, and please understand that Baker Tilly, nor Sam or I, or any of our people with our firm are recommending that you implement one of these scenarios. What we wanted to do was paint some different options that range from revenue centric to expenditure centric strategies. But you see some smattering of perhaps some different, cost saving issues that are up front on the revenue side, but on the other, side, the significant operating expenditure and service level reductions might include a revenue here and there. And that's because of the gap that's being addressed and trying to be addressed. So we've got 3 slides that summarize graphically what's in your report on pages. Basically, they're summarized pages 18 through 20. Sam, you want to flip to the next one? This is basically the picture of scenario 1. And what you'll see in each of these scenarios is we tried to identify a combination of strategies and time them in such a way that would, number 1, ensure that the reserves do not fall below an appropriate level. Let's just start there for 1, okay? And that's the graph that you see on the right-hand side. But number 2 is to ensure that by the time we hit the end of the forecast period, which is 10 years that we've done, that the gap is solved. And so therefore, annually beyond that, by the time we hit 2034, we see that we're in the blue, we're not in the red, we're in the black, I guess. So, so this is the graphic portrayal of scenario 1, which included things that you're seeing on the table that's summarized on page 18, which is the traffic red light enforcement, economic development strategies, utility tax, admissions tax, B&O, and MPD. And we wanted to show this to you again as an example. And what this strategy does is it also includes an assumption that we would at least do $1 million of per year of capital expenditures starting in 2028. Now that's really small, right? But as you see, as the gap gets addressed and based on the assumptions and the timing that's involved here, by 29, you're starting to add to your reserves. You are generating a surplus. And so it provides a total of let's say about 17 million in additional fiscal capacity for the general fund to perhaps address some of the underfunded or unfunded capital needs that you have. It gives capacity to be able to provide services that you haven't been able to provide. This is, again, an example of one scenario that tends to be more revenue centric. The second scenario tried to use a little bit more of a balanced approach where it combines some, expenditure reductions, to Larry's point, eliminating the vacant positions um, and some other, revenue strategies in there, but would require additional service reductions of 2.75 million to be able to keep you at or above that threshold. But you see what happens is that, again, by just modeling that, it provides for some additional fiscal capacity. And so you could restore some of those positions, but because of the timing to get to where you need to be to make sure that the red line on the right-hand side of this graph stays above what we targeted for this of the 25% level, that you would need to do some things in advance to be able to get you to a point where you could then implement that. And I will say that we've seen a lot of agencies use strategies where they try to write their own fiscal ship on the expenditure side to the fullest extent possible before needing to go to the community and say, hey, look, we need you to partner with us in order for us to be able to, because we've done the things that we think we can do to still maintain services to your satisfaction and expectation. And sometimes that bodes well in terms of being able to generate goodwill within the community and understanding that, oh yeah, we don't want to see this degrade any further. And perhaps we're willing to partner. So that's, again, just another food for thought in terms of identifying these. And then the third scenario really relies significantly on really more of the expenditure reductions, but in this case, it's catastrophic because you would need about 16 million in service level reduction, which would decimate services that are provided within this community. There's not a lot of there in terms of being able to make a significant mark on reducing it. Expenditures, and you see that it drops closer to that 10% level because when you're looking at having to model service reductions, not only will it take time to implement those, but you're doing those as a last resort. And so, again, we're not recommending any one of these scenarios, but we wanted to give you some ideas of what that looks like. And I will say that I think Julie had indicated in an email, not only she had pulled together a chart that kind of summarizes all of them. So it was very helpful, Julie. Thank you. Nancy, you had also forwarded some information that I think was really helpful in the question about whether or not our fiscal model can be used dynamically as you all start having the conversations about how to model this. And we have created that tool so that we can just go through that and turn strategies on and off, create new strategies, make some changes in terms of the fiscal impact assumptions so that we can model this and see what it does to that baseline forecast to address that. And that's what we want to be able to help you with as we go through this on the next two meetings to get you to a point where you're feeling comfortable being able to make a recommendation. When you do this, it's all about managing the annual fiscal gap and making it as sustainable as possible, and also making sure that when you're doing this, that you're giving yourself sufficient time to get these strategies implemented. Because if we say tomorrow, well, let's just go forward with a $20 TBD, for example, there's some work that needs to be done to get to that point. There's a lot of not only just staff level work that needs to get done, but it's really working with the council and with the community, y'all, to really understand and embrace that. And then, Aaron in his shop, and we'll have to do all the administration aspects in terms of making sure that revenue comes in. In some cases, some of these ideas can be implemented within a 6-month time frame. In other cases, it could be 2 or 3 years. And so we need to think about that. And we thought about that when developing these different scenarios and the timing, because we know that it's going to take a little while to do that. And I'll just give one example on scenario one. One of the first items that's on here is this photo traffic red light enforcement that would start in 2025. And if the council made a decision at by the end of 2023, that the city would need to start doing all of the analyses and the reports to justify where the locations are, to get somebody on board, a contractor on board to be able to do the implementation if it decided to move forward with it. And then where you would start seeing some of those revenues coming into place. So that lead time needs to be considered as you start thinking about the different strategies that you might recommend through to Scott, that ultimately then goes to the city council. Any questions on that? And I want to also, Sam was very instrumental in terms of helping to build the scenarios as we went through this and finalized them. So looks like
remember how
Nancy and
long it
John
takes-
in the room.
How
Go
long
ahead.
does it take to implement the utility tax?
I apologize.
How long does it take to implement the utility tax?
Did we use the utility tax?
How long to implement it?
Oh, how long to implement the utility tax? That's one that would take probably, it could take a good 18 months from the date that the decision is made to do that. Sometimes it can be expedited depending on how much you want to outsource to have some assistance to do that. But you're having to talk with each of the utility providers, especially if you added telephony, cell providers. You have to now reach out to all the cell providers and make sure that they are able to implement that utility tax for you. So it is typically about an 18-month lead time to be able to get something like that in place. Some are easier than others. Cable franchise, you know who your cable providers are in the community. If you decide to move forward with a utility tax on that, that's more simple than the telephone side is much harder. And then the other utilities are kind of somewhere in between that.
Question for Scott and Aaron, actually. We've talked, and I agree that this focus should be on the big policy issues, but what actions has the city taken sort of behind the scenes, at line item level that we don't need to be involved with, but maybe should know about, like fee policy for development services? Are you at 50 or 100% total recovery? What does parks look like? What other savings actions maybe have you taken, just as examples?
Yeah, thank you, John. I appreciate that. So we are going into the mid-biennial budget process now, and as part of that, we're looking at where we can take some reductions in our in what we're spending moving forward. We always look at the fee schedule to make sure that we are getting as close to full recovery as we can get by law. As costs go up, sometimes we need to adjust those. And as part of the comp plan process, some of those things we'll be reevaluating. But that's our responsibility on our end to make sure that we are being good stewards of the dollars. And so in all likelihood, what we bring forward to council will include some reductions in the already approved biennial budget for next year.
Sam, I don't know if you wanted to add anything further on some of the scenario discussion.
No, Steve, you hit the points that I was wanting to make. What I would say is not having to do with these scenarios, but the discussion that you all have been having. I've just been so impressed with the level of thought you've put into this and the questions you've come with. Sitting back here, it's been really fun to listen to, and I'm excited for what you guys will be coming up with here over the next couple of meetings.
Good. What I'd like to do then, and I just want to take just do a process check here. We have a hard stop at 9 o'clock. We're at 8:30 right now. I think we can wrap up what we need to wrap up here, but we want to allow some time for conversation about this next piece, which is how do we, using the royal we, as a team, build a consensus recommendation to the city manager in terms of how to address this. And so that's really what our plan is for these next couple of meetings. I'm going to ask Sam to kind of lead the conversation here. If your throat is up to it, my brother.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, and so, we now have the understanding of the gap and a little bit of how we got here and what the issue is. We've read up on and understand the different strategies that have been presented. And so now it's decision-making time, right? Which we'll do here over the next one or two meetings if necessary. We did a little today, and I think there'll be more room at the meeting on the 10th for you all to share those individual perspectives about each of the strategies, whether you're for them and what level, or you don't love it, but you can live with it, or you can't at all, right? And I think what we want you to reflect on a little bit here is how you might want to go about sharing those perspectives, reflecting on the strategies and how your support of them and at what level, and how you might want to go about building consensus. And I tasked you a little bit at the last meeting to think about a decision-making framework around this, and I want to open it up to the floor. If anybody has any thoughts about how you might want to go about doing that, either between now and the meeting on the 10th or at the meeting on the 10th. Now, Steve and I, of course, have some experience doing this, and we have some examples of how it's been done in the past, but want to leave it to you all as a task force here in Sammamish to have that discussion amongst yourselves, and if someone has some thoughts or ideas to go ahead and share those.
Don, go ahead.
I'd like to hear some examples of how it's been done elsewhere.
Okay. Sam, you want to kind of go through some thoughts that we've put together on that?
Yeah, and I previewed it a little bit, and I'm going to share a different slide here that has an example from a community that we thought worked pretty well. And I realize that this picture is probably a little small for you to see, but it is essentially a matrix of the strategies associated, revenue enhancements or expenditure savings or shifts, and then allows you all to make some sort of choice about whether you support the strategy. And again, as I mentioned before, you could say, yes, I love it, let's do this. Maybe I could get behind this, but it's not my favorite, or I wouldn't support this type of strategy, and allow for a little continuum of support. And then how would you prioritize those various strategies that you support, right? This is the first thing I would choose to implement, and is the silver bullet for me. I would, and these are among all of the things that I would support doing immediately, or first. As we think about creating a plan and moving through the different strategies and modifying the fiscal model each year biennium, and realities change, and maybe you can shelve some strategies if they're not one you would pursue as a priority. And then how successful you think they will be, right? In terms of being able to implement them, or in the case of council, they're approving of it, or in the case of those revenue options that the community needs to partner on, and whether the community will be supportive of those as well. This could be done This type of spreadsheet could be created and this type of work could be done over the next couple of weeks ahead of the meeting on the 10th. And then you do this individually as homework, right? Send those back to Steve and I to compile. And so at the meeting on the 10th, at the outset, we can share where the consensus is and where you all have landed as a group with your thoughts, and then begin to do that sharing, the individual sharing. If there, as you start to develop the consensus recommendations and identify those that you as a group prioritize the most to the least, and what you would be comfortable with recommending to Scott to recommend to council. So this is one way that we have seen it before.
Can I just say that we do a similar thing like this at the Human Services Commission when we're reviewing the applications. The individual members go through the applications and do like a ranking, and then we come together and just, discuss the rankings. And that way everyone, comes prepared. They're able to give input, hear other people's, ideas and thoughts around. But it helps just organize the thinking around it and the discussion. So I was gonna, if I was gonna suggest something, it would be some sort of tool like this.
Michael.
Go ahead, Michael, I guess.
Yeah, and a question for Sam. Yeah, I think many of us have seen things like this. Makes a lot of sense. In addition to this, Sam, included in here, because of my old eyes here, I can't read all the detail. It seems like, there is whatever the 16 things that we're going to choose from in of these different options that generate revenue or savings in some way. And we are trying to, if I've read the reports correctly, we're trying to eclipse $13 million annual, threshold and another 5 million by 2033, so something like that. Is it possible then for us to have, because you use spreadsheets to do calculations, we could choose those things, and as we choose those, you could see, did I eclipse 13 and did I get over 5 by this cafeteria collection of things? Because otherwise we might not make it, right? We'll only choose a few things, like, oh, guess what, that wasn't enough. And if we all are able to, come up with our strategy in our head of that, I think we probably would be quite prepared to talk to each other, because my strategy said this, and this is how I got to 18 million because of I like these things and I don't like these things, or whatever that might be. And that might allow us to share them more quickly if the numbers are in there. So Sam, I don't know if that was your thinking too.
Yes. Yeah. As you are prioritizing those strategies, or, selecting, yes, I support this strategy.
Yeah.
We can toggle on, right. And add the dollar amount of that strategy, so that you can see how much you've identified.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about what Don said earlier. If I don't have to go too far, I don't want to. Like, if the utility gets me there and the parks gets me there, I don't know if I want to pull 16 levers unnecessarily.
Sure. And, so there's a couple of different approaches. One is, and it can be a yes and. One is that we provide you the fiscal model and the dashboard that allows you to then go in there and select the strategies and play with the timing so that you see what the timing is and whatnot. The other is to identify, Michael's like, yeah, I'll go for that. Excel junkie, you. But we understand that some people are don't have that joy of Excel, and so the other component, which I think is also valuable, very valuable, is this concept that's up here, which is give us your perspective of each of the different strategies that have been identified, and to what extent do you think that they make sense in Sammamish? And again, the different criteria options there about the yes, maybe, no, or pursue it as a priority, or as a second priority, or third priority, or don't even talk to me about it. It gives us a sense, and we can start building some consensus to see, well, gosh, 7 of the 8 of you said that, it's green, yeah, thumbs up for everything. The second one's like, "Nah, I'm not quite sure if I'm there." And you can have then a conversation about whether you include that as part of the plan that you would recommend. So one is letting you play with the model a little bit if you want to do that, to see how you would potentially build a full package scenario, and whether or not it addresses the gap. But the other component of this is really to be able to harvest from you individually, what are your perspectives of the different strategies in terms of moving forward, so that we can then bring it together with the full group and look at it together and say, okay, are we seeing some commonalities or some areas that maybe will require some deep discussion? That makes sense?
Absolutely. And I guess maybe I was assuming that it's unlikely that I would put into my plan that I completely disagree with. Right? If I'm going to get over the threshold and to get there, why am I going to put in something I hate or that I could not support? Right? So I
Yeah.
was kind of doing those concurrently. So yeah, we can do that.
Owen?
I think it's great to having kind of these two separate tools. One is this to see amongst us, what is the level of consensus on each of these items? That's great. And secondly, having that tool where you can toggle on and off so that did my plan reach that threshold that we need to achieve, right? So if I'm doing 10 million, that's not a plan for us. But if all of us contributed their view of here's my 13 and 5 additional $1 million plan, then at least we all came with an idea. And now we can look at consensus and say, okay, where among us are we really aligned? And then we can kind of discuss our pros and cons at that point.
Okay.
So I think it's great having those two tools.
And it might mean that based on that, as luck would have it, all of us agree on some things and we don't even have to talk about them, right?
Could we?
Yes.
Knock on wood, that happens on the
Say,
first
I
on the
like where
first
you're going,
try.
Michael. I'm all in.
All right, here we go.
Larry, go ahead. Larry? Oh,
I know we're looking at time, but time is what I'm going to refer to. I think we have to realize where we're sending this proposal. And is there any, we could pick the best 5 that met all the criteria unanimously, but we will also want to include an addendum that allows the city council to do something with.
While your deliverable is to Scott, ultimately you've got to think about that in terms of the ultimate decision makers that are going to have to wrestle with this decision. Don?
I like what you've said so far, and I also, Steve, like what you said about having some comments about why I really feel this should be used, why I feel this should not be used in our community. I think that's good. And perhaps another place where we can make comments about, well, maybe there's another way of looking at this. Outside the box thinking.
And we can also, create in our, let's just call it a survey tool right now, the opportunity that if you have come up with an idea that should be considered, add that to that. And then we'll have some conversation around it. Yeah. Christine, were you going to?
I really am excited about this tool and just want to say thank you to everyone for your comments. I think it's been a really good discussion. When I'm thinking about the guiding principles for making it a decision as I do my own model, I've heard tonight about timing, the ability to implement it, as well as not reducing services or minimizing impacts to services. Are there any others that I'm missing that I should consider? I mean, does that sum it up in your mind?
Something that occurs to me is, would it be acceptable to the community? I know on our Parks Board, we go round and round. With a Parks bond issue, we have a lot of expenses coming up. for development, like the Pickett property, developing that property. We should, a nice big fat bond issue would really help us develop it, but would it be a go with the city, with the community? I mean, I'm excited about the idea, but with the community as a whole at this time with the economic, situation everybody faces, is this a good time for a parks bond issue? And I don't think it is. So I think maybe in your own sense, your friends, the community, that would be something I think else to add. Would it, is it, do you personally think, based on the people that that it's a go, like maybe you're a golfer, have a lot of friends that are golfers, what would they think about So I think maybe that would be also something to include, from your perspective, whether you think it would be could be successfully adopted in the community that does that make sense?
Gotcha.
I appreciate, Nancy, you bringing that up, because I think in no small part, this is what this group is essentially offering up. And I think it has to be your sense of what you think the community, again, I think I said this last meeting, what does the community value? And if now is not the right time, then it's probably not a high enough community value at the moment to move forward with it. And so I think that I would hope that you all would take that into consideration as you think about these things, because you all are hopefully reflective of different parts of the community. And that's why it's so great to get this group together that is disparate, yet all equally involved, but appreciate your community in different ways. And so that's one of the pieces of bringing you all to the table, is to get that perspective. So I really appreciate the way you frame that, Nancy, because I think it's important.
Any other thoughts? Sam, do you have any idea of then how we will want to proceed then?
I've got some work to do to create a decision-making tool similar to this one for you all. I'll get that done quickly so that you have some time with it ahead of the meeting on the 10th. It'll be similar to this, and as you indicate that it's a strategy that you would support and fully support, not just maybe. That will be the indicator to add that dollar amount to your total sort of running value, as it were. When we transmit it, we'll remind you, but I think we'll want your homework back by the 8th of August, so that we have a day to compile it ahead of the meeting on the 10th. And if you thought you were done with homework, I'm sorry.
That it's digital and no dog's going to be eating them. Okay, guys.
Is it by midnight or?
Midnight is great. Midnight your time is great.
All of us all together, is that what you're thinking?
Yeah.
You'll be able to You'll create one that would merge everybody's thoughts.
Yeah, we'll compile it all together and go to the tote board and see what the survey says. I mean, that's kind of the concept that we're talking about here. And I mean, and I think that we're all a team, right? Y'all are a team. And so we need to make sure that you understand that we will attribute to, each of you what it's not going to be anonymous like I did member A, member B, member C. It's going to be each of you. So that way you can have a conversation about, why did you say that? Or what was your perspective there? So you all good with that?
Very powerful.
Yeah, it is.
Rich wanted to say something. Michael,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead.
Maybe to throw a wrench in the works, say the utility tax, and that maybe that would be one that folks would support. I noticed that Issaquah has, for water and sewer, they just have 3% instead of 6%. Now they're one exception. Most of the other cities are higher. And then also for solid waste or garbage, I might not have a tax on that, because I think we want to always encourage folks to have garbage, and because you get illegal dumping. Not saying that folks in Sammamish might, but I know sometimes out in the woods you see that. So I wonder if we could run the numbers with the 3% and also no garbage tax. And then that'll be some number per year that we get, 6% on all the other ones. So that could be a scenario that I could probably support.
Yeah.
with the different numbers than what you have proposed.
Yeah, so if any of you have thoughts like that, like about, the gradations of implementation of some of these, we'll figure out a way for you to be able to, in your survey tool, to be able to identify what your thoughts are on that. I would use some of the analysis in here to help inform some of your thoughts about that. But, I mean, it was based on a 5 or 6% utility tax, right? So 3% would be about half of that. And you can see what the different, things are there. We'll have the ability to do that analysis on the back end, but we need to kind of hear from you in terms of what your perspectives are on that. And to that point, Rich, what you do there. Michael, go ahead.
Just to get clear on the next session we're together, and Sam too, if we do this well, we will have our input and we'll have an agreement in a tool like this, and it'll work and we'll agree. Is that basically the complete agenda for next time?
I think, without speaking for Sam, yeah, I think that's it. Sam, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, if you all agree, if it turns out, Michael, that, you send it back and everybody agrees on enough strategies that it fills the gap, then awesome, right? That's the
Okay.
ideal scenario. It may be that more discussion needs to happen amongst you all, and
Yeah.
so that we'll do that.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it through the discussion. We would come to that, because I don't think it's a majority rule issue, because that probably is a bad way. That's, like I always say, that's like two wolves and a sheep deciding what to have for dinner. I was thinking, yeah, I was thinking more like some of you have some real insight that I don't have, and I can be swayed because of your knowledge base. And so, after all that, I'm saying that the intention is for us to walk out of here.
Yeah,
with that.
I was trained in interest-based negotiation and problem solving. Some of you may have heard about that tool or term, and basically you're focusing on the interest, but ultimately you get to a point where either, yes, I'm all for that with my thumb up. I feel I'm not quite there yet, but at least I feel like I've been heard. That's a thumb sideways, and the thumb down meaning, no, I'm not there. We need more conversation about it. And I think that's a great, model to just consider and think about as we start talking about, what the strategy is. And frankly, it's got to be based on you guys. I mean, I'm hopeful that you'll want to come up with a consensus recommendation, because I think that for the sake of this community and for the ability for it to actually have the impact that's necessary for you long term, I think there's a much more power in having you as a team that have come together and have made recommendation, as opposed to something less than that. So we'll see if we can get there. Great. Well, we don't have to dawdle for 8 minutes if you don't want to. Some of us have a flight to catch. Any final thoughts? Check out as we go. Anything?
Yes, one quick question.
Julie,
Yep, I see that Kirkland has a levy lift on the ballot coming up, right? We should kind of watch that as maybe a sentiment that might be relevant to our city. Is that reasonable to think, or?
Julie, this is Scott. We'll be watching. Kirkland's not the only one.
Okay.
Maple Valley has a levy lid lift. This is kind of pervasive. Either cities are contemplating or they already are. There is no not for the most part in the region.
Okay, good. Thank you.
On that note, it's been a privilege to be with you today, Sam. We hope you get better. Julie, we hope to see you live and in person the next time, hopefully.
I will be there.
And we will see you on the 10th, but you're going to be seeing several emails from us, and we'll ask you to turn in your homework class by August 8th. So how about an 8 o'clock on August 8th? How's that for a time? There you go. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.